Central question: what does it cost to become who you truly are? Salt wind moves across a rocky island in the Ionian Sea. Somewhere below, waves strike stone that has not moved in 3,000 years. The hall stands on a hill above the harbour. Firelight leaks from its doorway. Inside, men are laughing, too loudly, the way men laugh when they believe no one can stop them. They have been here for years, eating another man's cattle, drinking another man's wine, courting another man's wife. They believe the master of this house is dead. They are wrong. Outside, in the dark beyond the firelight, an old beggar sits at the threshold. His hands are scarred, his back is bent. Nobody in the hall looks at him twice. Beggars are common enough, and this one is filthy, sunburned, forgettable. But if you looked closely, if you looked the way a wife looks at a husband, or a dog looks at the master who raised it from a pup, you might notice something. The old dog lying in the dung heap by the gate lifts his head. His ears go up. His tail moves once, weakly, for the first time in 20 years. Then he lies back down. And he dies. The beggar does not move. He cannot move. Not yet. Because the story that brought him here, barefoot, disguised, sitting in his own house like a stranger, began 20 years earlier, on a beach 600 miles away, when a war finally ended and a man believed wrongly that the hardest part of his life was over. He was wrong about that too. What happened to him in between, across 10 years of storm and monster and grief, across a decade in which he lost every single one of his men, in which he wept on beaches for a home he could not reach, in which he was offered immortality and refused it, is one of the oldest stories human beings have ever told each other. We usually call it an adventure. It is not an adventure. It is a question, asked across 3,000 years, that every generation has had to answer for itself. What does it cost to become who you truly are? Homer never answers it directly. He makes you walk the whole road first. So will we.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
To understand why this story mattered so much to the people who first heard it, you have to understand something that sounds strange to modern ears. For the audience listening around a fire in 700 BCE, this was not fiction. It was memory, stretched and reshaped by 400 years of retelling, but memory all the same. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a network of palace kingdoms, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Knossos, ruled by warrior kings who controlled bronze, grain and trade routes stretching from Egypt to the Black Sea. Archaeology confirms these palaces were real. Massive stone walls at Mycenae, so large that later Greeks believed only giants could have built them. Clay tablets written in an early Greek script called Linear B, listing chariots, sheep, and the names of gods still worshipped 1,000 years later, Zeus, Poseidon, even Dionysus. Then, within a span of decades, this entire world collapsed. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. The causes are still debated: drought, invasion, internal revolt, the mysterious sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records, a cascading failure of trade networks that no single kingdom could survive alone. The archaeological evidence shows burned palaces, abandoned cities, and a sudden catastrophic loss of literacy across the Greek world. For nearly 400 years afterward, Greece could not write, but it could still remember, or rather, it could still tell stories, generation after generation, each poet reshaping the last poet's version, embellishing, forgetting, inventing, until sometime around the 8th century BCE, a poet or poets working in the oral tradition, whom later Greeks called Homer, shaped these fragments into two enormous poems: the Iliad, about the final year of a war at a city called Troy, and the Odyssey, about one soldier's 10-year journey home from that war. We do not know if Homer was a single person. We do not know if the Trojan War, as described, ever happened at all, though archaeologists have excavated a real city at Hisarlik in modern Turkey, burned and rebuilt multiple times, that may have inspired the legend. What we know for certain is narrower and, in its way, more remarkable. For the audience who first heard these poems performed, sung to the rhythm of a lyre, in a language that had already grown ancient in their own mouths, this was not entertainment in the way we use the word today. It was instruction, it was memory, it was law. Picture the setting where this story actually lived, before it was ever written down. Not a page, not a screen. A courtyard at night, torches burning low, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat still hanging in the air after a feast. A singer, a rhapsode, stands with a lyre held against his chest, and the audience, seated on benches or the bare ground, leans forward, because they already know how this story ends and they want to hear it again anyway. That is the strange power of epic. Everyone in that courtyard already knows Odysseus makes it home. The suspense was never about whether. It was about how much it would cost, and whether, having heard the price, you would still call it worth paying. We should also be honest about what separates this story from the world we live in now. This was a world without steel, without the wheel used for anything but chariots and pottery, without coined money. Wealth was measured in bronze tripods, woven cloth, cattle, and captured people. And it was a world in which slavery was not a moral crisis to be debated, but a simple, brutal fact of how households functioned, where women of noble birth could wield real influence inside the home while having almost none outside it, and where a guest's right to hospitality, Xenia the Greeks called it, was treated as sacred, enforced not by law courts, but by Zeus himself, protector of strangers at the door. Every villain in this story, without exception, is a violator of that single sacred rule. Every hero, without exception, upholds it, even when it costs them everything. Keep that word in mind, Xenia. You will hear its violation again and again, in a cave sealed by a boulder, in a hall packed with uninvited men eating another man's cattle. The entire moral architecture of this story rests on a single idea. How you treat a stranger at your door reveals who you actually are. The Odyssey told them how a good host should treat a stranger, how a wife should wait, how a son should grow into a man, how a king should return to a throne that others have tried to steal. It told them what happens to those who forget the gods, and what happens to those who remember them too selectively. And underneath all of it, it told them something darker and more universal. That survival and homecoming are not the same thing, and that a man can cross the entire known world and still not know, when he finally reaches his own front door, whether he's allowed to walk through it. Before we meet the man at the centre of this story, we need to understand the world that shaped him, because Homer's audience did not need this explained to them. They lived in fragments of it still. We do. Ithaca itself was never a wealthy kingdom. Homer is almost defensive about this, having Odysseus describe his homeland, again and again, not as fertile or golden, but as rugged. A rough land, but a good nurse of men. Goats picked their way across hillsides too steep for horses. The soil was thin. What Ithaca offered instead of wealth was harbour and position, a small defensible island along trade routes that connected the Greek mainland to Italy and the wider Western Sea. A palace on an island like this would not have resembled the marble columns later Greeks or Romans built. Picture instead a great hall, a megaron, built of rough-hewn stone and timber, its roof supported by wooden columns, a central hearth burning at all times, in a fire pit sunk into the packed earth or stone floor, smoke rising toward a vent in the roof above. Along the walls, storerooms held the household's true wealth. Wine in great clay jars taller than a man, olive oil, wool, bronze weapons and tools, woven cloth worked by the women of the house, on upright looms strung with wool weights. The same kind of loom Penelope will use 20 years from now to weave and secretly unweave a burial shroud in the firelight. Meals were eaten seated on chairs or benches, meat carved and distributed by rank. The choicest cuts to the most honoured guest, a portion so significant that giving someone an inferior cut was itself a calculated insult. Wine was never drunk undiluted. It was mixed with water in a large mixing bowl, a crater, and serving it too strong, or serving too much of it, was itself a sign either of extraordinary hospitality, or, as we will see in Odysseus's own hall, of guests who have stopped respecting the house that shelters them. Religion was not a separate category of life, walled off into temples and festival days. The gods were assumed to be present, watching, easily offended, and occasionally willing to walk among mortals disguised as beggars or strangers, which is precisely why hospitality carried such weight. You could never be entirely certain the ragged traveller at your gate was not a god in disguise testing you. Zeus himself bore the title Xenios, Zeus of strangers, because the Skyfather who hurled thunderbolts and ruled Olympus also, apparently, cared whether you fed the beggar at your door. War, when it came, was fought at close range, Bronze against bronze, spear and sword, chariots used mainly to carry champions swiftly to the front line, rather than as sweeping cavalry charges. Death in this world was sudden, physical, and almost always visible to the men who caused it. Nothing like the distant mechanized violence of later ages. A man who fought at Troy for 10 years, as Odysseus did, had killed at close enough range to see the faces of the men he killed over and over for a decade. And death itself, once it came, led somewhere specific and by every account deeply unwelcome. The house of Hades, a shadowy underworld where the souls of the dead persisted as thin, whispering echoes of themselves. Not punished exactly, for most of them simply diminished, drained of vitality, capable of a kind of half-life only when given blood to drink, as we will see for ourselves later in this story. There was no promise of paradise waiting for the virtuous. There was only, for almost everyone, this, a long, grey forgettable afterward, which is precisely why, in a world like this, being remembered, having your name survive you, sung by poets for generations after your body has gone to ash or earth, was not vanity. It was very nearly the only kind of immortality any ordinary mortal could actually hope for. Keep that in mind, too. It will explain almost everything Odysseus does wrong. Every great story needs someone the audience can hold on to for the length of the whole journey. In the Odyssey, that is a man named Odysseus, king of a small, poor, rocky island called Ithaca, a place he loved, Homer tells us, more than any of the rich and beautiful lands he would later be offered instead. Homer's most common description of him is a single Greek word, polytropos. It means, roughly, of many turns, a man who could bend, adapt, and reshape himself to any situation. Later translators have rendered it as cunning, complicated, even the man of twists and turns. All of these are true, none of them is complete. Here is who he is, what he wants: to go home, not to conquer, not to be remembered, not even primarily to be a hero. He wants his wife, his son, his father, his island, his bed carved from a living olive tree that cannot be moved because it grows through the floor of his own bedroom. A detail that will matter enormously 20 years from now, at the very end of this story. What he fears: being forgotten, being erased, dying anonymously, far from home, with no one left to speak his name. What he doesn't understand, not yet, that intelligence without humility is its own kind of trap, that the same cleverness which will save his life again and again will also, again and again, be the thing that costs him everything he has left. He is not a perfect man, he is a proud one. He lies constantly, to friends and enemies alike, sometimes for survival, sometimes, it seems, simply because he enjoys it. He is capable of extraordinary tenderness and in the same year of extraordinary cruelty. He weeps more often in this poem than any other hero in ancient literature, openly, unashamed, on beaches, in strangers' halls, at the sound of a song about his own war. He is, in other words, recognisably human in a way that 3,000 years has not dulled. And when we first meet him in the story's actual timeline, not chronologically but where Homer chooses to begin, he is not fighting monsters. He is sitting on a beach, alone, crying, a prisoner in paradise. Before we follow Odysseus through his own memories, we need to understand that he is not the only one on a journey. While he weeps on Calypso's shore 600 miles away, his son is becoming someone. When the story opens, in the poem's actual first pages, before Odysseus ever speaks a word, we do not meet the hero at all. We meet Telemachus, a young man of about 20, who has never known his father as anything but an absence. He was an infant when Odysseus sailed for Troy. Every memory he has of a father is second-hand: his mother's grief, old servant stories, the weight of a name he has to live up to without ever having watched the man who earned it. He is, when the poem finds him, sitting miserably among the suitors crowding his own family's hall, imagining, Homer tells us directly, that his father might appear suddenly from nowhere, scatter these men like leaves in the wind, and reclaim his rightful place. It is the daydream of someone who still, on some level, expects rescue, rather than expecting to become the rescuer himself. The goddess Athena, who has favoured Odysseus since the Trojan War, and who orchestrates much of this entire story from the shadows, arrives at the palace disguised as an old family friend, and gives Telemachus the push he has needed for years. Stop waiting, call an assembly, confront the suitors publicly, and then leave the island yourself, sail to the mainland and find out from men who fought beside your father whether he is alive or dead. It does not go smoothly. The assembly he calls dissolves into shouting, the suitors mocking him openly, refusing to leave his mother's hall, refusing to acknowledge that a boy barely into manhood has any authority to command grown men twice his age. He nearly weeps with frustration and rage, but he does not back down entirely, and that in itself is new. He sails in secret at night, so the suitors, who are actively plotting to ambush and murder him before he can return with news that might strengthen his claim to the throne, do not learn of his departure until it is too late to stop him. He visits two men who fought at Troy alongside his father, Nestor, the aged, garrulous king of Pylos, who offers warmth, hospitality, and long stories but very little concrete news. And then Menelaus, king of Sparta, husband of the infamous Helen whose abduction started the whole war, who tells Telemachus something no one else has been able to confirm, that Odysseus is alive, trapped on an island, held by a nymph, weeping for a home he cannot reach. It is not a rescue. It is not even a reunion, but it is the first real evidence in the entire poem that Odysseus still exists, and it comes to us, notably, through his son's own initiative, his own willingness to leave the safety of home and go looking for the truth, rather than waiting passively for it to arrive. This matters more than it might first appear. The Odyssey is often remembered purely as Odysseus's adventure, but Homer structures it as two journeys running in parallel. A father learning, the hard way, what it costs to survive, and a son learning just as painfully what it means to stop being a boy who waits and become a man who acts. When these two journeys finally converge, in a swineherd's hut we will reach soon. Both of them will have earned the reunion in different currencies, one through 2 decades of loss, the other through a handful of frightened, decisive weeks that changed how he saw himself. 7 years before the beggar sits at his own threshold, Odysseus is trapped on the island of Ogygia, held by a minor goddess named Calypso, whose name in Greek means, almost too perfectly, the one who conceals. She is not a monster. That is what makes this section of the story so unsettling. Calypso loves him, genuinely by every measure the text gives us. She has offered him immortality, eternal youth, a permanent place in her bed and at her table, freedom from every danger that has nearly killed him 12 times already. Any rational calculation would say, stay. He refuses. Every night, Homer tells us, Odysseus lies beside a goddess who loves him and cannot love her back the way she wants. And every day he walks to the rocky shore alone and weeps, staring at the horizon, aching for a wife who has aged 20 years while he has not aged a day. This is the first great philosophical question the poem asks, and it asks it quietly, almost in passing. What is a life worth if it cannot end? What is love worth if it costs you your name, your family, your history? The specific, irreplaceable, mortal shape of your own life? The gods watching from Olympus eventually intervene, not out of mercy for Odysseus, but because the goddess Athena, who has favoured him since the war, finally shames her father Zeus into acting. Hermes is sent to Calypso with a command she cannot refuse. Let him go. She does, bitterly. She helps him build a raft, provisions him with wine and bread, and watches him sail away from an eternity she offered, and he chose, without hesitation, to give up. He does not make it far. Poseidon, god of the sea, still furious at Odysseus for a crime we have not yet witnessed, wrecks the raft in a storm designed to kill him. He survives only by the intervention of another goddess, and 2 days of swimming, naked, half drowned, until he washes ashore, filthy, salt-crusted, barely alive, on the coast of a kingdom called Scheria, home to a seafaring people called the Phaeacians. He collapses beneath a thicket of olive branches, covering himself in dry leaves for warmth, and sleeps the sleep of a man who has nothing left to lose. It is here, exhausted and stripped of everything, no ship, no crew, no clothing but sea-ruined rags, that the young Princess Nausicaa finds him the next morning. Athena has visited her in a dream the night before, urging her to wash the palace linens at the river mouth in preparation for her own future wedding, and so it is entirely by design, though Nausicaa does not know it, that she and her handmaidens are playing catch with a ball near the shore when it sails into the water, and their shrieks of laughter wake the castaway sleeping nearby. Odysseus emerges from the underbrush naked, salt-crusted, and half-wild with hunger. Homer compares him strikingly to a lion coming down from the mountains, driven by need, terrifying to look at, and yet somehow not without dignity. The handmaidens scatter in terror. Nausicaa alone stands her ground, and Odysseus, drawing on every ounce of the cunning and courtly grace that have kept him alive for a decade, does not grab for her or beg outright. He keeps his distance, covers himself with an olive branch, and delivers a careful, disarming speech, comparing her to the goddess Artemis, praising her family, asking humbly for nothing more than a scrap of cloth and directions to the nearest town. It works. Nausicaa, impressed rather than frightened, orders her handmaidens back, has them clothe and feed him, and leads him toward her father's city, though she asks him, tactfully, to follow at a distance rather than walk beside her, aware of exactly what the local gossips would make of a strange striking man walking into town at the princess's side. Her father, King Alcinous, and mother, Queen Arete, receive the stranger with the full weight of Phaeacian hospitality. A people, Homer tells us, uniquely favoured by the gods, whose ships need no pilot or rudder, because they know, by instinct alone, the thoughts of every man who sails in them and carry him safely wherever he wishes to go. It is, in other words, the one place in this entire poem where getting home might actually be simple, and it is in the Phaeacian palace that follows, fed, bathed, honoured as a guest, moved to tears not once but twice by a blind singer named Demodocus, performing songs about the very war he survived, so overcome that he has to hide his face in his cloak while the rest of the hall listens with simple pleasure. That Odysseus finally does something he has refused to do for 7 years. He tells them who he is, and for the first time we hear the story from his own mouth. Everything that happened after Troy fell, everything that turned a 10-day voyage home into a 10-year Odyssey. He begins where it started to go wrong. Troy has just fallen. After 10 years of siege, 10 years of stalemate broken only by a final, elaborate deception, a hollow wooden horse, Odysseus' own idea, credited to him specifically by later tradition as the trick that finally ended a war neither side could win by force alone. The city burns. Its walls, which had withstood a decade of Greek assault, come down in a single catastrophic night of fire and slaughter. Odysseus' 12 ships, packed with soldiers who have survived 10 years of siege warfare, watch the smoke rise behind them and finally turn toward home. 10 years away. Every man aboard those ships has a wife, a child, a father, who may or may not still be alive, waiting across a sea none of them have crossed in a decade. The mood, as they push off from the beach at Troy, should be triumphant. In hindsight, knowing what is coming, it reads instead like the last untroubled morning any of these men will ever have. They do not get far before Odysseus makes the first of many mistakes that will cost his men everything. Sailing north, they raid the city of the Cicones at ISMARUS, an act of simple wartime plunder, unremarkable by the standards of the age. Odysseus wants to load the ships and leave immediately. His men, drunk on victory and captured wine, refuse. They want to feast on the beach. The delay is fatal. The Cicones return with reinforcements from inland. In the battle that follows, 6 men from each of Odysseus' 12 ships are killed. 72 men dead on a beach for the sake of one more night of wine. It is a small tragedy compared to what is coming, but Homer places it first for a reason. It establishes, immediately, that this will not be a story about a perfect leader guiding his men safely home. It will be a story about a flawed man and the price other people pay for his flaws. The survivors sail on. And then the sea itself turns against them. A storm, natural this time, not divine, drives the fleet 9 days off course, past the edge of the known world into waters no Greek sailor had charted. They make landfall on the coast of the Lotus Eaters. The danger here is not violence, it is the opposite. The native people offer Odysseus' scouts a strange fruit, the lotus, and any man who eats it loses instantly and completely any desire to go home. Not through poison, through contentment, through the sudden, overwhelming conviction that nowhere else matters. 3 of his men eat it. Odysseus finds them sitting placidly among the Lotus Eaters, weeping when he tries to lead them back to the ships, begging to be left behind, not out of fear, but out of a happiness so total it has erased their families, their homeland, their own names. He has them dragged, weeping, back to the ships, and bound beneath the rowing benches until the drug wears off. It is a strange, quiet horror, easy to miss on a first reading, a monster that kills you not by devouring your body, but by making you forget you ever wanted to survive. The fleet sails on, low on food, uncertain now of their course, and directly toward the worst mistake Odysseus will ever make. They find an island thick with wild goats, and beyond it, a larger land where a strange, solitary people live. Giants, Homer says, with a single eye set in the centre of their forehead. CYCLOPS. They have no laws, no assemblies, no ships, no agriculture beyond what grows wild. Each lives alone with his family, indifferent to his neighbours, indifferent, most dangerously, to the gods. Homer takes care to describe them almost as an anti-civilization. Everything Greek society valued, inverted. No community, no shared meals with strangers, no respect for Zeus, protector of guests. A world of pure, isolated appetite. Odysseus, against the advice of his own instincts. He says so himself, looking back with the bitter clarity of hindsight, chooses to explore anyway. Curiosity again, the same trait that will define his entire journey, for better and for far worse. He takes 12 of his best men, and deliberately a skin of extraordinarily potent wine, a gift from a priest of Apollo, so strong it was normally diluted 20 parts water to 1. He does not yet know why he is bringing it. He will need it soon. They find a vast cave near the shore, its floor crowded with pens of lambs and kids, its shelves heavy with baskets of cheese and pails brimming with whey and milk. His men beg him to steal what they can and leave immediately. Odysseus refuses. He wants, he admits later, to see what manner of creature lived here, and perhaps to test whether the old laws of hospitality might yield him a guest gift. It is a fatal miscalculation, born entirely of the same curiosity that will later make him shout his own name across open water. Polyphemus returns near evening, driving his flocks before him, and the sound of his approach, Homer says the earth itself seemed to shake, sends the hidden Greeks scrambling into the shadows at the back of the cave. The giant seals the entrance with a stone so massive, Homer tells us, that 22 four-wheeled wagons could not have dragged it from the doorway. No group of men could ever move it from the inside. Only then does he notice his guests. He does not offer them hospitality, the sacred obligation, in this world, of host to stranger, the very obligation this island's entire people are said to disregard. Odysseus, ever careful with words, tries invoking that law directly, telling the giant they come as suppliants under Zeus's protection, that Zeus punishes those who mistreat strangers and beggars. Polyphemus's answer is a kind of blasphemy that would have chilled Homer's original audience to the bone. The Cyclops, he says, care nothing for Zeus or any god, being far mightier than they are. Then, without further discussion, he seizes 2 of the men, dashes their heads against the cave floor and eats them raw, bones and all, Homer specifies, washing the meal down with unmixed milk, while the surviving Greeks watch, weeping, unable to do anything but pray to a Zeus who does not immediately intervene. He goes to sleep, full, indifferent, blocking the only exit with his own enormous body. What follows is the most famous episode in the entire poem, and it is worth slowing down for because it contains in miniature everything the Odyssey is actually about. Odysseus's first instinct, to kill the sleeping giant with his sword, is stopped by a moment of genuine strategic thought. If he kills Polyphemus, no one alive has the strength to move the boulder sealing the cave. They would simply die trapped alongside the corpse, so instead he waits. The next day, after Polyphemus eats 2 more men and leaves to graze his flock, Odysseus sharpens a massive wooden stake, hardens it in the fire and hides it. That evening, when the giant returns, Odysseus offers him the powerful wine he brought from the ship. Polyphemus, delighted, drinks bowl after bowl and asks Odysseus his name, promising a gift in return. Here Odysseus gives the answer that will define the rest of the entire poem. "My name," he says, "is Nobody." The giant, now drunk, laughs and promises that nobody will be eaten last. Then he collapses into a stupor. Odysseus and 4 chosen men heat the stake in the dying fire and drive it into the giant's single eye, twisting it, Homer says, the way a shipwright drills through a plank of wood. And the giant's scream brings the other Cyclops from neighbouring caves, shouting to ask what's wrong. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus screams. "Nobody is attacking me by treachery." Hearing this, his neighbours, understandably confused, assume it must be a divine affliction, something no man can help with, and they walk away. It is one of the oldest and best jokes in Western literature. It is also a trap Odysseus has built for himself, though he doesn't know it yet. The next morning, blind and desperate, Polyphemus removes the boulder to let his flock graze, feeling along their backs to catch the men as they try to escape. Odysseus, in a final piece of cunning, lashes his remaining men beneath the bellies of the giant's own rams and clings, himself, to the thick wool underneath the largest ram in the flock. Polyphemus feels only the animals' backs. They escape. And here is where Odysseus makes the mistake that will cost him everything. Safely aboard ship, sailing away, he cannot resist calling back across the water, taunting the blinded giant, revealing his true name. "Cyclops," he shouts. "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." His men beg him to stop. He does not stop. Polyphemus, hearing the name, does something far worse than roar in pain. He prays. He calls to his father, Poseidon, god of the sea, the same sea Odysseus must now cross for 10 years to get home, and asks not that Odysseus die quickly, but that he wander, lose all his companions, and return home late, broken and alone, to find his household in ruins. Every single detail of that prayer will come true. This is the hinge on which the entire poem turns. Not a curse from a distant enemy, but a punishment invited by pride, by a man so hungry to be remembered, to have his name attached to his own cleverness, that he cannot let a monster believe nobody defeated him. It is the same hunger, Homer suggests, that drives every great and terrible thing men do, the need to be known, the need for your name to survive you. Odysseus will spend the next 9 years paying for the 10 seconds it took to shout his own name across the water. They come, soon after, to the floating island of Aeolus, master of the winds, a genuinely kind figure in a story increasingly short on them. Aeolus hosts Odysseus for a month, listening to the tale of Troy, and sends him off with an extraordinary gift, a leather bag containing every contrary wind in the world, sealed tight, so that only the gentle west wind remains to guide the fleet straight home. For 9 days, it works. Ithaca comes into view. Odysseus, exhausted from personally steering the ship the entire time, finally allows himself to sleep. His men, watching him sleep beside the mysterious bag, assume it holds treasure. Odysseus is hoarding from them. Gold or silver from Aeolus, kept secret out of greed. They open it. Every wind in the world bursts out at once. The storm drives them backward, across the entire distance they had just sailed, all the way back to Aeolus's island. When Odysseus returns to beg for help a second time, Aeolus refuses outright. A man cursed twice by misfortune this severe, he says, must be hated by the gods themselves. He will not risk helping him again. It is a small, devastating scene, easy to underestimate. Home was visible. Home was in sight. And it was lost not to a monster, not to divine malice, but to ordinary human suspicion, men who did not trust their own leader enough to ask him a simple question. Worse follows almost immediately. Landing among the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants, Odysseus's fleet is trapped in a narrow harbour and attacked with boulders hurled from the cliffs above, the ships smashed like toys, the men speared like fish, Homer says, and carried off to be eaten. 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships are destroyed in minutes. Only his own ship, which he had kept moored outside the harbour out of caution, survives. He began this journey with 12 ships and roughly 600 men. He now has 1 ship. Perhaps 45 men remain. The scale of loss compounds with almost unbearable speed now. This is the escalation the poem builds, moving from personal mistakes to catastrophic, irreversible group tragedy in the space of a single chapter. And the survivors, traumatized and diminished, sail on toward an island where the danger will not be violence at all, but something far stranger. The total loss of the self. They drift, shattered and half-starved, until they reach Ea, home of the enchantress Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios, and by some accounts sister to the same sorceress who will later curse a hero named Jason and his Argonauts. A family, it seems, with a talent for transformation and menace both. The island rises out of the mist thick with oak and alder, and from its centre Odysseus's scouting party can see smoke curling from a stone palace deep in the woods and hear, faintly, a woman's voice singing as she works at a loom, weaving cloth so fine, Homer says, that only a goddess could produce it. Odysseus sends half his remaining men, led by his lieutenant Eurylochus, to scout her palace, while he waits with the rest by the ship, having drawn lots to decide who would go. A small, telling detail. Even now, exhausted and grieving, he does not simply order men into danger. He lets chance decide, and Eurylochus draws the unlucky lot. They find Circe singing at a loom, surrounded strangely by wolves and lions that do not attack, because these are not wild animals at all, Homer implies, but men she has already transformed. She welcomes the scouts warmly, feeds them a feast laced with drugs, and touches each one with her wand. They become pigs. Not symbolically, literally physically, grotesquely, while retaining, Homer specifies, their human minds. They can still think. They can still remember who they were. They are simply trapped now inside animal bodies herded into pens, weeping in a language no one can understand. Eurylochus, who stayed outside and watched through a window, races back to warn Odysseus, refusing to return himself even under threat of death, one of the only times in the poem a subordinate directly successfully defies his king. Odysseus goes alone. On the path to Circe's palace, he is intercepted by the god Hermes, who gives him a protective herb called moly, black-rooted, white-flowered, a plant so powerful, Homer says, that only a god could safely pull it from the earth. Hermes also gives him precise instructions. When Circe strikes with her wand, draw your sword and threaten her life, she will yield. It happens exactly as predicted. The drug fails to work. Circe, astonished, immediately recognizes that only one man alive could resist her magic, a hero whose coming, she says, was foretold to her by Hermes himself long ago. Threatened, outmaneuvered, Circe surrenders, and then, in one of the poem's stranger turns, becomes a genuine ally. She restores the transformed men to their human forms, younger and more handsome than before, Homer notes, as if the ordeal had somehow renewed them, and welcomes the entire crew as honoured guests. Odysseus stays with her for a full year. It is worth pausing on this because the poem does not judge it the way a modern audience might expect. A year, feasting and sharing Circe's bed, while a wife waits faithfully across the sea, and Homer offers no condemnation. It is Odysseus's own men, eventually, who remind him of Ithaca, who ask him gently whether he has forgotten his home the way the Lotus Eaters forgot theirs. He has not forgotten, but he had perhaps allowed himself to rest, and the poem seems to understand something true and a little uncomfortable about grief and trauma and endurance, that sometimes a person needs a full year in a safe place, even a strange and enchanted one, before they can face what comes next. What comes next is the strangest chapter in the entire poem. Circe tells him that before he can go home, he must sail to the edge of the world, to the land of the dead, and speak with the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias, the only soul in the underworld permitted by Persephone's grace to retain his full mind and memory after death. Odysseus must travel to the land of the dead while he is still alive. They sail to the edge of the world, a place of perpetual mist and darkness, where the sun's rays never reach, at the border of the river ocean itself. Following Circe's instructions exactly, Odysseus digs a pit, pours offerings of milk, honey, wine and water, and cuts the throats of 2 black sheep, letting their blood pool in the trench. The dead come to the smell of blood the way living things come to the smell of food. They swarm, countless, formless, whispering. And Odysseus, sword drawn, must hold them back from the blood until Tiresias arrives, because it is only by drinking the blood that any shade can regain, briefly, the power of coherent speech and memory. Tiresias comes first and drinks. His prophecy is precise and terrible. Odysseus will reach home, but only after further suffering. His men, he warns specifically, must never touch the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios on the island of Thrinacia. If they do, every one of them will die, and Odysseus will return alone, on a stranger's ship, to find his own house overrun by men trying to steal his wife and his throne. Then Tiresias steps aside, and the underworld becomes, for a while, less a place of prophecy than a place of reckoning. Odysseus' own mother, Anticlea, drinks the blood next, and only now, in the land of the dead, does Odysseus learn that she died of grief, waiting for a son who never came home. He tries 3 times to embrace her ghost, 3 times his arms close on empty air, because a shade, Homer tells us with quiet devastation, has no more substance than a dream or a shadow. Other ghosts follow, each drinking the blood in turn to speak. Among them is Elpenor, the youngest of his crew, who died just days earlier, not in battle or storm, but in the stupidest way imaginable. Drunk and half asleep, he fell from Circe's rooftop and broke his neck, and in the chaos of departure no one had time to bury him. His shade begs Odysseus for a proper burial and funeral mound when they return to the world above. A small human request amid all this cosmic terror. A reminder that even in a story full of gods and monsters, the dead still want more than anything, simply to be remembered by name and given a marker that says they existed. Then comes Agamemnon, the Greek commander at Troy, murdered by his own wife the moment he returned home victorious. A warning spoken directly to Odysseus, never to trust a homecoming completely, never to assume that surviving a war means you have survived everything. Agamemnon's voice, as Homer renders it, is bitter in a way none of the other ghosts quite match. He tells Odysseus to approach his own homecoming secretly, to trust no one fully, not even, he adds pointedly, a wife. Though he is careful to add that Penelope's evident loyalty makes her nothing like his own murderous queen. It is advice poisoned by his own catastrophe, and Odysseus will, in fact, follow it almost exactly. Arriving home in disguise, trusting almost no one until the very last possible moment. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, appears next, and delivers one of the most quietly devastating lines in ancient literature. Odysseus tries to comfort him, calling him powerful even in death, ruler among the dead. Achilles rejects the comfort outright. He would rather, he says, be a living slave to the poorest man on earth, working someone else's land for wages, than rule as king over all the dead. It is worth sitting with that line for a moment. Achilles chose glory over a long life. That was his defining decision, the entire tragic engine of the Iliad. And here, from beyond death, he tells us he was wrong. Fame does not warm you. Glory does not answer when you speak to it. A short, remembered life and a long, forgotten one apparently weigh the same. Once you're only a whisper in the dark, once nothing is left of you but a name other people repeat. This is the poem's philosophical centre, arriving early, half buried in a scene about ghosts, the same question Calypso's island asked from the opposite direction. What is a life worth, and what should a person be willing to trade for it? Odysseus returns from the land of the dead changed, not physically but in some harder-to-name way. He has spoken with his own mother's grief. He has heard the greatest hero of his generation renounce the very glory that killed him. He knows now with certainty that home will not be waiting for him unguarded. He sails back to Circe's island one final time to bury a crewman who died in an accident, and to receive her final warnings about the dangers ahead. Then he sails toward the Sirens. Circe's warning is precise. The Sirens sing a song so beautiful that any sailor who hears it steers toward the sound and dies, wrecked on the rocks among the bones of everyone who came before. A stretch of coastline littered, Homer says, with the rotting corpses of men who could not resist. Nobody knows what the Sirens actually sing. That is the terror of it. The temptation is not specified because it is meant to be different for every listener. Whatever a person wants most, whatever truth or pleasure or memory, would make them willing to die for one more moment of hearing it. Odysseus does something almost no one else in the poem thinks to do. Instead of avoiding the danger, he chooses to experience it safely. He orders his men to plug their ears with beeswax so they cannot hear anything at all. Then he has them bind him tightly to the ship's mast with strict instructions. No matter what he says, no matter how desperately he begs, do not untie him until the Sirens' island is far behind. They sail past. The Sirens sing. Homer, tantalizingly, still does not tell us the words, only that they promise Odysseus knowledge, that they claim to know everything that has ever happened on the fertile earth. Bound to the mast, Odysseus strains against the ropes, begging his crew to release him. His deafened men only row harder and tie him tighter, exactly as instructed. It is a strange kind of victory. The only man in the story who hears the Sirens and lives, but only because he arranged in advance to be powerless in the moment temptation actually arrived. He did not trust his future self to resist. He built a trap for his own weakness, and it worked. There is little time to reflect on it. Immediately ahead lie 2 dangers Circe warned about, and there is no clever trick that survives both. The strait ahead is narrow, bordered by two horrors on opposite sides. On one cliff lives Scylla, once a woman transformed by jealous magic into a monster with 6 heads on long necks, 12 legs, and a bark like a young puppy despite her enormous size, who reaches down from her cave to snatch sailors directly off the decks of passing ships. She cannot be fought. She cannot be avoided by sailing wide, because directly opposite her lies CHARYBDIS, a monstrous whirlpool that swallows the entire sea 3 times a day and spits it back out, capable of sinking a whole ship at once. Circe's advice is brutal in its clarity. Sail close to Scylla's side. Lose 6 men, 1 for each of her heads, rather than risk the whole ship and crew to CHARYBDIS. Odysseus, notably, does not tell his men this plan. He arms himself, stands at the prow, ready to fight a monster Circe has already told him cannot be fought. A small human refusal to simply accept a mathematically acceptable loss. It changes nothing. As the ship passes beneath the cliff, Scylla's 6 necks strike down at once and sees 6 men, lifting them, screaming into the air. Odysseus watches, helpless as they call his name, the only name they have left to call, while she devours them at the mouth of her cave. Homer describes it as the single most painful thing Odysseus witnessed in his entire journey. Not the storms, not the giants. 6 specific men whose names we know, calling for a leader who could not save them in the last seconds of their lives. They survive the strait. Ahead lies the island of Thrinacia, sacred to Helios, home to his immortal cattle. The exact place Tiresias's ghost warned them never to touch. Odysseus wants to sail past entirely, remembering both Tiresias's warning and Circe's echo of it. His men, exhausted, grieving, starving, and furious after losing 6 companions to Scylla, beg to make landfall for just 1 night's rest. He relents, extracting a solemn oath. No one touches the sacred cattle. They will eat only the provisions Circe supplied. A storm rises the next morning and does not stop. For a full month, contrary winds trap them on the island. Their food runs out. They survive on fish and birds, growing hungrier and more desperate by the day, while herds of gleaming, unnaturally beautiful cattle graze peacefully nearby, belonging to no one who seems present to stop them. Odysseus walks inland to pray alone and falls asleep. It is the single worst moment for him to have left his men unsupervised. Eurylochus, his lieutenant, the same man who once refused to enter Circe's palace and saved himself by disobeying, makes the opposite choice this time. He convinces the starving crew that a quick death at sea, if the gods choose to punish them, is better than a slow death by starvation on this island. Better to die with a full stomach. They slaughter the sacred cattle. Homer includes a detail here that no rational retelling would invent, and that is precisely why it feels true to the world of the poem. The flayed hides of the cattle are said to crawl on the ground like living things, and the meat on the spits bellows, as if the cattle were still alive and screaming even as they roast. Odysseus wakes to the smell of meat and understands immediately that everything is now lost. It is lost. When the winds finally allow them to leave, Zeus, petitioned directly by an enraged Helios, who threatens to shine his light in the underworld forever unless the crime is punished, destroys the ship with a lightning bolt the moment they reach open water. Every man dies, every single one except Odysseus, who clings to wreckage and drifts alone for 9 days before washing up, starving, sunburned, utterly alone, on Calypso's island, where the story of his travels finally catches up to the moment we began with. 600 men left Troy with him. 1 man survives to tell this story. Homer does not soften this. He states it plainly, without sentimentality, in the poem's opening lines, before the story even begins. Odysseus struggled to save his companions and his own homecoming, but he could not save his men no matter how much he wanted to. They lost their own lives, the poem says, through their own recklessness, the fools. It is a harsh judgment, and a fair question hangs over the whole poem because of it. How much of this catastrophe belongs to the men who broke their oaths, and how much belongs to the leader who kept leading them into danger, who taunted a cyclops, who slept beside a bag of stolen winds, who could not simply sail past one more island? The poem does not resolve the question cleanly. It lets both truths sit together. The men had agency and made a fatal choice, and Odysseus was their king, and every king's failures are also, always, partly his men's story to suffer. Back in the Phaeacian palace, Odysseus finishes his tale, his hosts, moved, honoured to have sheltered such a man, load a ship with treasure and remarkably sail him home themselves while he sleeps, delivering him to the shores of Ithaca in the dead of night without him even waking. He wakes on his own island and does not recognise it. Athena has shrouded the land in mist to hide his arrival from any watching enemy, and it is Athena herself, disguised first as a young shepherd and then revealing her true form, who tells him where he is and what has happened in his absence. It is not good news. For years, his palace has been occupied by well over 100 suitors, sons of the island's leading families, along with men from neighbouring islands drawn by rumours of Penelope's beauty and the very real prize of an unclaimed kingdom. They have taken up permanent residence in his hall, eating his cattle and pigs by the dozen, drinking his wine cellars dry, sleeping with his serving women, harassing his wife Penelope with demands that she choose one of them to remarry, and treating his son Telemachus, now a young man of 20, as an obstacle to be humiliated in his own home, or increasingly murdered outright before he can inherit anything at all. It is worth understanding why they can get away with this at all, in a world that supposedly holds hospitality sacred. Penelope occupies an almost impossible legal and social position. Odysseus has been gone so long that most assume him dead, yet without a body, without certain proof, she cannot simply be declared a widow and freely remarry. Nor can Telemachus simply claim the throne outright while his father's fate remains unconfirmed. The suitors have exploited this uncertainty for their own gain, treating an occupied, ambiguous household as an opportunity rather than a crime, calculating, correctly for years, that no one has the power or the will to make them leave. Penelope has held them off for years through a famous trick. She agreed to choose a new husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's aging father, and then secretly unravelled each night's work by torchlight, keeping the shroud forever unfinished, until a treacherous servant finally revealed the deception. She has run out of tricks. The suitors are losing patience, and Telemachus, meanwhile, has left Ithaca entirely, sailing to the Greek mainland to seek news of his long-lost father, a journey that has, unknown to him, made him the suitors' new target. They plan to ambush and kill him on his way home. Odysseus has returned to find his own household on the edge of collapse. Here the poem slows deliberately, and it is worth understanding why. A lesser story would rush Odysseus straight into the palace for a dramatic confrontation. Homer does the opposite. He makes Odysseus wait, disguised by Athena as an old, broken beggar, his skin wrinkled, his hair thinned, his fine clothes replaced with rags, and sends him first not to his wife, not to his throne, but to the hut of his old swineherd, Eumaeus, a loyal servant who does not recognize his own king. This is deliberate. Before Odysseus can reclaim anything, the poem insists he first witness what loyalty actually looks like, stripped of any obligation of fear or reward. Eumaeus, believing he's speaking only to a wandering stranger, feeds him, houses him, and speaks with unguarded grief about the master he still believes is dead. A portrait of devotion offered to someone the servant thinks can never repay it. It is here, in this humble hut, that the story delivers its first great emotional turning point. Telemachus, warned by Athena of the ambush waiting for him, evades the suitor's trap and comes on his own to Eumaeus's hut, not knowing his father sits inside disguised as a beggar watching him. Athena briefly restores Odysseus's true form and sends Eumaeus away on an errand, leaving father and son alone for the first time since Telemachus was an infant. Telemachus, seeing a stranger transformed suddenly into a figure radiant with divine favour, assumes at first he must be looking at a god. "I am no god," Odysseus tells him. "I am your father." Homer lets this moment breathe in a way the rest of the poem rarely allows. Telemachus weeps. He embraces a father he cannot fully believe is real, a man he's heard about only in stories, in his mother's grief, in 20 years of rumours and false hope. Odysseus weeps too, openly, the way he has wept throughout this entire journey, in front of a son who is seeing for the first time that his father is not simply a legend, but a man who has clearly suffered. It is one of the only unguarded moments Odysseus allows himself in the entire poem. He has lied to nearly everyone he has met since Troy, Circe, Calypso's people, the Phaeacians, Eumaeus himself moments ago. Here, finally, with his son, the disguises stop. This is the emotional core the poem has been building towards since Ithaca first appeared on the horizon. Not the fight to come, but this, a father and son, alone in a swineherd's hut, becoming for the first time allies. Together they begin to plan. Disguised once more, Odysseus enters his own palace as a beggar, the scene that opened this documentary. He endures deliberately every humiliation the suitors offer: mockery, thrown furniture, insults about his poverty and his age, all absorbed with the patience of a man who has already survived far worse and is now, finally, close enough to see the end of the road. His old nurse, Eurycleia, washing the beggar's feet at Penelope's request, recognizes a distinctive scar on his thigh, a wound from a boar hunt in his youth, and nearly cries out his name before Odysseus, gripping her by the throat, forces her into silence. Not yet, not before he is ready. Penelope herself, meanwhile, speaks with the disguised beggar at length, without recognizing him, in one of the most quietly moving conversations in the poem. She tells him of her grief, her exhaustion, her fear that she has run out of ways to delay the suitors, and in a striking piece of dramatic irony, the disguised Odysseus, testing her, tells her that her husband is alive and will return home very soon. A promise Penelope, 20 years hardened against false hope, does not quite let herself believe. She announces the next morning a final contest, one Athena herself puts into her mind. She will marry whichever suitor can string Odysseus's old hunting bow, an enormous weapon, a gift from a friend in his youth, that only Odysseus himself has ever been strong enough to draw, and shoot a single arrow cleanly through the aligned handle holes of 12 axe heads set in a row, a feat of both strength and precision that borders on the impossible. Odysseus's old bow is carried out from the storeroom where it has hung, unused for 20 years, and Penelope weeps openly at the sight of it, before setting the terms and withdrawing upstairs, unable to watch what happens next. One by one, the suitors try and fail. The finest young men of the island, strong enough by every other measure, strain against the ancient wood and cannot even bend it far enough to loop the string over its tip. They rub the bow with tallow to soften it. They warm it by the fire. Nothing works. Each failure is a small mounting humiliation, and the tension in the hall builds with every man who steps up, sweats, strains, and finally sets the bow down in defeat, until the suitors themselves begin to grow uneasy, sensing something is deeply wrong with a night that was supposed to end in a wedding. Then the beggar asks to try. The suitors mock him. Telemachus, playing his part in the plan, insists his mother's guest be allowed his turn, and Odysseus, after 20 years, after Troy, after the Cyclops' cave and Circe's island and the land of the dead and Scylla's jaws and the burning cattle of the sun and Calypso's shore, picks up his own bow as easily as a musician picks up a familiar instrument, strings it in a single fluid motion, and fires an arrow clean through all 12 axe heads. The hall goes silent. Then Odysseus turns the bow toward the suitors themselves. What follows is not a fair fight. It is not meant to be. Odysseus strips off his beggar's rags, and Homer marks the moment with real ceremony. He leaps onto the raised threshold, quiver of arrows spilled at his feet, and announces to the stunned hall exactly who has been standing among them, unrecognized for days. Then he puts an arrow through the throat of Antinous, the cruelest and most arrogant of the suitors, at the exact moment the man is lifting a golden cup to drink, before anyone in the hall has even understood that the contest is over and something far more serious has begun. With Telemachus, Eumaeus, and one other loyal herdsman beside him, and with Athena's aid, appearing at points disguised as an old family friend to steady their courage, and at the story's most decisive moment, revealing her full divine radiance to break the suitor's will to keep fighting, Odysseus bars the hall's only exit, and begins killing the men who spent years eating his food, courting his wife, and plotting his son's murder. Homer does not sanitize the violence. It is brutal, methodical, and prolonged, room by room through the great hall, until every one of the suitors lies dead among the overturned tables and spilled wine of their own last feast. The servant women who collaborated with the suitors are executed as well, in a scene many modern readers find genuinely difficult to reconcile with the story's tenderness elsewhere. A reminder that this poem comes from a world with a moral code very different, in places from our own, one the story does not ask us to fully endorse, only to understand. The hall, once full of laughter and theft, is now silent except for grief. It is finished. Ithaca is his again. But the poem still withholds its final reward, because reclaiming a throne, Homer insists, is not the same as reclaiming a marriage, and Penelope, informed that the beggar has killed every suitor and revealed himself as her husband, does not run to him. She waits. She studies him from across the hall, silent, unmoved, unwilling to trust a joy this large after 20 years of disappointment. Telemachus is furious at what he sees as his mother's coldness. Odysseus himself seems uncertain how to close the distance. Penelope, testing him one final time, orders a servant to move his marriage bed outside their bedroom wall so he might sleep there tonight. Odysseus explodes, genuinely, uncontrollably angry, because that bed cannot be moved. He built it himself decades earlier around the trunk of a living olive tree still rooted in the earth beneath the bedroom floor. Moving it would mean cutting through a living trunk. It was never meant to be moved, ever, by anyone. It is only this, his fury at an impossible request, proof that only the real Odysseus could know a secret shared by no one else alive, that finally breaks Penelope's guard. She weeps. She runs to him. 20 years collapse into a single embrace. And Homer, who has withheld so much sentiment throughout this violent wandering poem, finally allows himself a single, extended simile to describe what she feels, like the relief of exhausted sailors, shipwrecked and struggling against a heavy sea, who finally feel solid ground beneath their feet again. It is, notably, the same image the poem has used again and again for Odysseus's own suffering, for the first time applied instead to the woman who waited, whose own 20-year ordeal of grief, pressure and uncertainty has gone almost entirely unnarrated, endured off-page in a hall full of enemies while her husband's adventures filled the poem's centre. They talk that night for hours before finally going to bed. Not the wedding night reunion a lesser story might have rushed toward, but something quieter, and in its way, more moving. Two people, each changed by 20 years apart, telling each other everything that happened, filling in the gap between the young husband who sailed for Troy and the scarred, weathered stranger who has just killed over 100 men in their own great hall. Homer closes the circle deliberately. The man who once looked at his island only as something to leave, something to conquer glory beyond, now looks at it as the only thing he ever truly wanted. There is a final complication. The suitors' grieving families rise in a brief, violent uprising against Odysseus, seeking blood vengeance for their sons, and only the direct intervention of Athena, commanding both sides to lay down their weapons, brings the story to its true, final peace. Even a homecoming this hard won, the poem insists, requires help beyond human strength to actually hold. But the war, at last, is over. Not the war at Troy. That ended 20 years and one whole lifetime ago. The much longer, much stranger war of simply trying to get home. Before we close this journey, it is worth asking a question we have set aside until now. Why did this particular story, out of the countless tales that must have been sung around Bronze Age fires and lost forever, survive? Why this one? Part of the answer is practical. The Odyssey, alongside the Iliad, became the foundation of Greek education itself. For centuries, Greek children learned to read using Homer's verses. Public performances of the poems were, by law, part of major Athenian religious festivals. Philosophers argued about them. Playwrights adapted them. By the time Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad on his campaign centuries later, reportedly keeping it beneath his pillow alongside his dagger, Homer's poems were already considered ancient, foundational, almost scriptural in their authority over how Greeks understood themselves. But there is a deeper reason the Odyssey specifically has never stopped being retold, in nearly every culture and language that has since encountered it. Unlike the Iliad, a poem largely about the terrible narrow logic of war and glory, the Odyssey is about something almost every human being eventually faces, the difficulty of returning changed to a life, and the people who once knew a different version of you. Soldiers coming home from any war in any century have recognised something of themselves in Odysseus's difficulty simply walking back through his own front door. Immigrants and exiles have recognised Ithaca in the particular ache of a homeland that keeps existing without you while you are gone. changing in your absence even as you long for it to stay the same. Anyone who has ever needed a decade or a divorce or a diagnosis or simply the slow accumulation of years to finally become someone capable of facing what they left behind has recognized something of Penelope's patient unweaving, Telemachus's frightened first steps into independence, or Odysseus's own long refusal, and then final, hard-won willingness to be truly seen. The word Odyssey itself has entered dozens of languages as shorthand for any long, transformative, difficult journey. Evidence, if any were needed, that this particular ancient Greek story about a lost king somehow became everyone's story. So we return to the question the story asked at the very beginning, before we understood what it was really asking. What does it cost to become who you truly are? For Odysseus, the cost was almost everything. 600 men who sailed from Troy with him, 12 ships reduced to one, then to none, a decade stolen from a marriage, from a son's childhood, from a father who died believing his son was already dead, immortality, offered freely by a goddess who loved him, refused in favour of a mortal life measured in decades rather than forever. He was not punished for being weak. He was punished, again and again, for being exactly what made him remarkable, clever, proud, restless, unwilling to simply let a mystery remain unsolved or a name remain unknown. The same trait that outwitted a Cyclops also cursed him to 9 more years at sea. The same curiosity that let him survive the siren's song nearly got him killed at CHARYBDIS' mouth. Homer never suggests he should have been someone else. The poem's affection for its flawed hero is unmistakable, even in his worst moments. What it suggests instead is something harder and more honest, that becoming fully yourself, living out the specific irreplaceable shape of your one mortal life, rather than the safe, eternal, anonymous version a goddess like Calypso could offer, will always cost something. Sometimes it costs everything you have. 3,000 years later, we no longer sail wine-dark seas past cannibal giants or witches who turn men into swine. But we still recognise this story in our own bones, because we still ask, in our own ways, the same question Odysseus asked on Calypso's beach, and in the land of the dead, and at his own threshold disguised as a beggar in his own home. Is it worth it? Is a short, specific mortal life, with all its grief, all its loss, all its unbearable cost, worth more than an easier one that erases what makes you you? Think of everyone this story asked to change, and how differently each of them had to earn it. Telemachus, who began the poem as a boy dreaming of rescue and ended it as a man who stood beside his father with a spear in his hand. Penelope, who survived 20 years of siege in her own home, no less an ordeal in its way than anything her husband faced at sea, fought entirely with patience, wit, and an unravelling shroud instead of a sword. Even the dead understood it, in their own bleak wisdom. Achilles, chief among all the heroes who ever chose glory over a long life, reaching out from the underworld to tell the one man who chose differently that he, in the end, had been right. Homer's answer, delivered not through a speech but through 20 years of storm and monster and grief, is the oldest answer human beings have ever given each other. Yes, it is worth it. Because a home you fought to return to is not the same as a home you never had to leave. Because a wife who waited 20 years is not the same as an eternity spent with someone who never had to wonder if you'd come back. Because the scar on Odysseus' thigh, the one his old nurse recognised in the dark, was proof, in the end, that he had lived a life. A real one, marked, wounded, imperfect, and entirely his own. The old dog at the gate recognised him and died, content having waited just long enough. The bow remembered his hands. The tree, rooted immovably beneath the marriage bed, was still exactly where he left it. Some things, the story tells us, are worth returning to, even when the road home cost you everything you had when you first set out, especially then. He looked at the island once and saw a kingdom to leave behind for glory. He looks at it now, an old man, scarred, diminished, and entirely alive, and sees the only thing he ever actually wanted. That is the whole of the story. That is the whole of the man. That, perhaps, is the whole of what it means to come home. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, subscribe for more forgotten stories from history.